Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We continue our working day, and the topic of the next press briefing is the failed coup attempt in Turkey, what it means. Our guest is Yönet Tezel, ambassador of the Republic of Turkey in Ukraine.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just thank in the beginning the Ukrainian Media Crisis Group for this opportunity. I appreciate an opportunity to inform the Ukrainian media, maybe to help you understand better what really transpired in Turkey, because it seems to me there is some amount of confusion and things that are coming out are difficult to believe. I think Ukraine is in a better position to understand. Nevertheless, I'll be happy to answer your questions after some minutes of my giving some of the facts. You all watched on TV as we did, I think, and you have a clear understanding of most of what happened. This was an attempt on the 15th of July to overthrow the elected government, the democratic process in Turkey. It aimed to establish afterwards, eventually, an authority that would be alternative to the democratic process, an authority alternative to good governance, possibly some sort of non-secular governance. And to do this, as you have seen, the perpetrators resorted to the weapons and the vehicles that were acquired by the taxes of the people, and they were turned against the people, used against the people. And inevitably, the whole attempt failed. I say inevitably because anyone who with a deep understanding or an appropriate understanding of Turkish society would know that the Turkish people would not allow this to happen. We thank our allies and friends who at the critical moment stood with Turkey on the side of democracy. We are especially grateful to President Poroshenko and Ukraine. In the early hours, we received his message of support and condolence. What happened, in fact, reveals the darker side of a larger process that was in the making, and it is quite easy to explain this as a terrorist activity, because after all, violence was used, force and illegal methods were used to take control, partly or fully, over government, and to provide an alternative authority. That is terrorism. What is behind this? Who is behind this? The major driving force appears to be a secretive, subversive group, a cult-like, a self-styled religious group, which had been trying to, and apparently with some success, infiltrating Turkish state institutions for some years. They were not fully unknown. There were investigations ongoing, and there is reason to believe that the way this coup attempt happened rather hastily shows that the investigations over the past 2 years were coming to a certain result, an end, and to preempt what was awaiting them as a last resort, they I think, launched this coup. how is it possible to explain that they even could hope this could be successful? The only explanation that I have is that these people apparently had lost touch with reality. They didn't know the reality of Turkey, of Turkish people, of the society. This organization, the Turkish acronym being FETÖ, which I just said fits into the category of terrorist organization, tried to use elements, though infiltrators within the army, the armed forces, and the police. But the broader attempt is beyond that. And had they been successful, I believe it would not be possible, but had they been, they would have lifted the Constitution, the fundamental rights, enforced the nationwide curfew. There would probably be summary trials, even no trials on people in jail, and hoping for impunity. Well, you Ukrainians know very well how it is important and yet difficult to bring people to justice, the perpetrators who use weapons against their people, against their society. In Turkey, we will not allow this impunity. That is why these extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures, which the government took, in line with the Constitution and in line with our international legal obligations, commitments, meaning the state of emergency was declared for 90 days. This state of emergency is exclusively directed at this organization, who might be associated with it, and of course who were behind the coup. Despite this tragedy, this misfortune, and the loss of human life, and in this sense, again, as Ukrainians, you will appreciate the mood in Turkey. Just a few years ago, end of 2013, early 2014, you saw what happened just here in this neighborhood in Maidan. 100 people were killed, around 100 people. 246 people were killed on the 15th, 16th of July in Turkey, mostly civilians. Snipers were used, tanks were used, F-16s were used. The parliament was bombed several times. The president escaped a assault team's attack. And, well, we saw it live on TV. The evidence is there. So the people are very determined, as is the government, the civil society, the media, and the political parties, of course, including the opposition. And with this sense of consensus-like national mood, people associated with this are being detained in line with the state of emergency regulations, procedures. And if there is enough evidence, those who are detained might be arrested or they might be freed. If they are arrested, they will be prosecuted. They might be found guilty or innocent, but the due process will apply. It is important that now there is a national consensus unity in Turkey, and frankly, we welcome it very much, because in politics especially, we've also had problems with polarization. Now, political actors in Turkey are showing their maturity to leave behind that and concentrate on the main issue of the day. One of the pillars of this unity, sense of unity, shared across civil society, the media, politics, political parties, and government and president, of course, is that everything that is being done should be done in the frame of law, the rule of law. So that is very important. There is a lively public sphere in Turkey. Every night there are televised debates on mainstream channels, and the sense of unity, with some differences as you might expect in a democratic society, is functioning. One observer said that probably what happened on the 15th and 16th is the only example in modern history where a people got out on the streets, seeing the tanks, assault helicopters, even jet fighters, stood against the coup and was successful in stopping it in its tracks. This is something to be cherished, I think, for anyone who wants the culture of democracy to deepen in our region. And I think that is the real story of the day. But in the rush to understand what happened, maybe this story did get lost somewhat, and I am disappointed with that. I wouldn't say that for Ukraine mostly, as I said, because of our closeness apparently with Ukraine and the capacity of Ukrainians to empathize more with us, we didn't see that problem very much here in Ukraine. What you've been hearing maybe about this organization sounds difficult to believe, but believe you me, the evidence clearly supports the accusations. Of course, the final truth will come out of the judicial process, but we have evidence, especially the testimonies coming out now from the investigations, pointing the finger at the obvious culprits, the perpetrators. It's been difficult for us, but we will overcome it without a doubt. We will come out of this stronger, democratically and otherwise. It might take some time to get back to normal fully, but already normal life continues. For tourism, for example, you might be interested. The state of emergency doesn't direct or apply at all to anybody but to the perpetrators, so the tourism resorts are not affected. Happily, this year, by the way, we have an increase in the number of Ukrainian tourists traveling to Turkey. The last figures I saw were 30 to 40%, even more increase depending on the city in the first 6 months of the year. As we speak, there is a group of Ukrainian journalists interested in Turkish tourism and resorts and how they might be affected from this. So they are there. Beyond me, you will have Ukrainian journalists to report back on what is there, and what is there is obvious that in that sense life continues. Yes, economically it was somewhat disturbing. We were concerned. However, again there, some 5% fall in the national currency, the lira, 7% fall in the stock exchange, stock market, all picking up, all recovering, simply because the fundamentals are strong in Turkey. Despite the fact that an apparatus, people, these cells, secret cells were used within the state tradition of institutions are still strong. That's why it is possible, despite the large number of suspects and of the secret organization, they are being detained and tried. The Prime Minister said the other day that the Turkish Prime Minister said that the state of emergency, in fact, is like a state of emergency in terms of the public authorities to deal with this. All public officials in the judiciary, in the police, army, of course, they've all been ordered back. Prosecutors, a big group of prosecutors, it was 70 the other week, maybe more now, are working full-time, 24 hours. This is a serious threat. We will deal with it as it requires. That's why state of emergency also assists Turkish authorities in this sense. I should also say that I also see in the press, in some of the commentary, maybe with less knowledge about Turkey, that this looks like suppression of the opposition. That is very unfair to Turkish society, given its diversity across the political spectrum. The people who are being targeted did not and do not form the opposition. The real opposition in Turkey are, despite their continued differences with the government, have taken a stance on the right side of history, simply because the Turkish people have traveled too far on the path of democracy to come back. We cannot unlearn democracy, as I think you will also appreciate that. The coup failed because it did not find a sociological reflection. The coup failed because a minority group was used within the army and the security forces, the police. The majority stood against it. The government stood very strong. The president stood very strong against it. And the parliament. Perhaps some of you did watch live when, in that early hours of that day, as the parliament was in extraordinary session, it was bombed. I saw the debris during live broadcast. I know you have many questions. I'm ready to answer them, of course. But, as a final note, the press is free, and commentators are free to ask whatever they want, to wonder, to make comments. That's understandable. But at this moment, it is important to not miss the bigger picture. Despite the tragedy, loss of life, by the way, we call these people martyrs for democracy, which again, Ukrainian audiences will understand and appreciate. Nothing can bring them back. By making democracy stronger, by making all institutions stronger, I think that's how we can pay our debt to them. And this good, positive story sometimes gets lost. Like the Ukrainian government's principled position, we also hope the larger part of the Ukrainian press will also follow in this direction. We will be ready to answer all questions. My government is. Part of these measures relate to our commitments at the Council of Europe, and our government is ready to answer them again. There is a process ongoing. From this negativity, there is some hope. There is, a lot of hope for coming out stronger. I think this is the gist of what I want to say in general terms. As I said, it might take a little time, but you will see the Turkey you know of. The Turkey that is strong, that has proven serious success over the years in terms of governance, economic performance, reforms, becoming a regional actor despite the difficulties we have in the region. And I must admit this all came at an unfortunate time. But we will overcome, and you will continue to see Turkey as a strong friend and partner of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now we'll have some time for questions. Yeah, please.
Mr. Ambassador, Vitaly Litvinenko, Information Agency Nation. The question will be for some other topic. You know, conflict between Russia and Ukraine has a serious problem for transit for our goods to Asian states, different Asian states. And our association requested from the Turkish side to make a larger quota for our goods to transit them for Asia from the Turkish side. But Turkish state disagreed. They requested, unfortunately. And the question is, why was such a decision? Is it a political decision or economically? Thank you.
I'm not sure if the facts of what you said reflect the reality. We have a good working relationship with the relevant Ukrainian authorities, in this case meaning the Ministry of Infrastructure. It was some weeks ago when the minister called me personally regarding a problem of some trucks, for example, not being able to go in. It turned out that there was a information management problem on the Ukrainian side. Again, we showed leniency, flexibility, it was resolved. The two countries understand very well that transportation forms a good potential we have between each other. I think a group of transportation and customs people were about to visit each other already this month, was it? I forgot the details. Maybe it might have to be now rescheduled. So I don't see a big problem there in that sense. Turkey, of course, is like Ukraine in a very geopolitically important area in terms of lines of transportation. And regarding the new Silk Road, I think there are opportunities to find the overlapping projects and have win-win scenarios. So I'm positive on that respect. In the spectrum of our relationship with Ukraine, it's all stories about potential. Now it's time to finally tap that potential, bring it to fruition.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The next question.
Hi, Vitaly Senko, News Agency Union. I would like to come back to our given topic. And I'm interested in a question. As all we know, Turkish government, after attempted failed coup, are imposing some tough measures towards different people from different spheres of society. For example, dismissing or firing a lot of people from universities, schools, etc. And I'm wondering, don't you think that those measures are really contradict to fundamental like human rights, human dignity? Like if it is only about investigation, why it is so like harsh towards academics? Like I don't see like real relation how they could be connected to those who are perpetrated coup. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a very valid question. It's difficult to believe, but you'd have to understand the extent of the threat that we face. Can you imagine, since the 70s and 80s, this organization, with its plans to infiltrate state, and by state, here's the sophistication, they have targeted 3 or 4 main institutions or sectors: the security forces, the army, educational institutions, and the judiciary, the public service. If they had been a legitimate political group, they would have aimed to be running for office, as all political parties do. They were aiming at a shortcut to take over control of government. And I personally, like quite a few other Turkish civil servants, feel appalled. We're appalled that they've been managed to set up mechanisms to manipulate civil service entrance exams, giving the questions beforehand to the candidates for infiltration. I've worked very much to go into civil service and to my job, to diplomacy, as have so many military officers, police officers, members of the judiciary, members in the Ministry of Education. And then suddenly you have these people, in many cases lacking merit, but because of the secretive, subversive group coming in over the years. Education has been a big, of course, target for them, and not only in Turkey but abroad as well, because it's such a nicely sounding, such a area of operation normally. But they've had to, going back to Turkey, they have extensions in the press and in the academia. But all those who are detained, please, this is important and would be unfair to those who might be innocent within them. They are being detained because of suspicion, because of some evidence that they might be working under what is clearly a paper, a school even, a private school in this sense, of course, who's attached to this group, even a university. And they might not be aware of this, but because of that link, the net, because of the extraordinary circumstances, the security net, the measures were rather held large. Now after detention, looking at the, meticulously though, because of the secrecy of this, the way they work, of this group works, some of them might be found to be innocent. They will be released. But they are under custody, or they are being asked to come and surrender to the police. Mind you, the investigation started already 2 years ago. Some of them have already escaped. And why the numbers are so large, and how could it be possible that the government security forces could go and find them right away? Well, those investigations had already produced a lot of evidence, but this final coup, use of violence, use of terroristic methods, that big evidence was not there for some. Plus, some who were caught red-handed had with them plans. And, for example, who would be appointed as the governor of that province? Who would become the head of the central bank? Who would become the head of the certain institution? Who would become maybe the new ambassador somewhere? Who would become the rector of that university? So, putting all this information, the government resorted to the state of emergency to be on the safe side. But the opposition and the government itself is saying, recognizing how it is important to sort the guilty from the innocent. This is a process, but at least that process should be given the benefit of the doubt, and that process should continue. If there are failures in this, of course people will criticize it, and there are some people already criticizing it in Turkey. But let that course, let that process take its course first. Without that happening, jumping into, threatening like cautionary statements in the first few days, I think was not very helpful coming from some areas. And my colleague, of course, reminds me, the measures that are taken, although they are under procedures of state of emergency, they are within the law. They can be appealed. Appeal to Constitution is there. after the end of the emergency, state of emergency, which is 90 days, as I said, but the government hopes to, if they can manage, to even finish the job before that. They can even ask for a stay of execution, stop governmental execution of some of the steps taken. I mean, there is a law under which all this is being made. The same sort of law which can be held accountable, that is, which can be appealed to, that France, for example, has been implementing for the last 6-7 months, and they've again extended for another 6 months, you know, just recently. And I think Germany, also for understandable reasons, extraordinary circumstances, extraordinary measures, but within the law nevertheless. So that's what's happening.
Thank you. My name is Christina Shamakin, the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Thank you very much for coming here and explaining the coup. I would like to talk a bit more about the detained. You have spoken about democracy, yet there are journalists being detained in Turkey, as well as media outlets are being shut down. There are more and more journalists being detained. Mm-hmm. Could you explain our rationale behind this and the rationale behind closing down media outlets? That's one. And two, how will this affect your the relationship between Turkey and the European Union? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, the same, the gist of what I've said applies to this too, but media is sensitive, yes, media, freedom of the media. Again, we have something positive that came out of this whole affair. The night when all this happened, one of the critical moments was, as you will remember, when the president was able to address the nation late in the early hours, late that evening, on a mainstream TV channel, not at all known for being pro-government. And this was demonstrated across the media, the mainstream media, the real media we have in Turkey, not those attached organically to this organization that I mentioned. That's why there's a unity. I watch from channel to channel every night. You know, there's a vibrant public sphere and media environment in Turkey, tens and hundreds of TV channels across the country. The ones which are organically linked, taking decisions in a hierarchy, attached to an authority abroad, are the ones who are the suspects. And this does sound maybe, you know, difficult to believe, but in my previous job in Turkey, I was head of research and also had a lot of relationship with the academia and the press, and the whole business of I was trying to follow who gets published where. Certain papers, certain TV channels, in order to get something published there, people would apply to to that hierarchy, which was still based abroad, and only with their blessing would that happen. The finances related to this and the whole public opinion management, public perception management project, I think was at the center of these pseudo papers. You know, I wouldn't even call them maybe media, pseudo media, and that's what are being targeted. That's why it's very unfair if you think that they form the opposition. But going back to my first point, the importance of a free media became even more evident in those first few days of the attempted coup and the people's resistance, because the media also played a big role in stopping it. As soon after this media outlet, this television channel which I mentioned to you, soon after they broadcast this, live on TV, they were raided by the renegade groups from the military. I looked at it, I couldn't believe it. It was happening, live. And I said, half an hour, 1 hour, because it couldn't last long. I knew the people wouldn't let this happen. This is not the Turkey that I know. And exactly, I think it took about half an hour. I think it took about 1 hour to take back Turkish state media, state television. So I understand your sensitivity to your colleagues, and all of them, of course, cannot be guilty. Maybe there could be some who didn't really know, but because we've thrown a net with caution, we will see. They will be tried. Please give the benefit of the doubt to that.
Mr. Ambassador, next question will be in Ukrainian, so please take the headphone.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Alexander Shevko, TV channel 1+1. I have a question. After the attempted coup, how the policy of Turkey to Ukraine may be changed in the context that politologists and experts are saying that Turkey may do a kind of frozening of relations with Western countries, and better relations are formed with Russia, and next week President Erdogan will meet Putin in St. Petersburg. What topics will be discussed there, and where Ukrainian issue will be on the agenda? And it is true that some experts say that Turkey may change its attitude to Crimean issue. Turkey previously blamed the annexation of Crimea. May it be changed in future? Thank you.
Valid questions, and has a very clear answer. Just bear with me for a few minutes. And I'm sorry, I should have mentioned also the EU to your question, so I'll mix these both. I shouldn't be disrespectful to anyone, but please, when people say experts in Turkey, please look at that with a pinch of salt. I mean, I'm reading some commentary, and they are talking about a country that I'm not from. It's not many people, but inevitably the public likes sensationalism, and that makes good headlines. But this is a serious business. People have lost their lives. And this is not just about an attack, an assault on a specific political party. It's against my way of life, the future of my children that I foresee for my children. So people should take this more seriously. Turkey's position regarding the West, the EU, and Russia, of course, because these things happened all at the same time, there is a lot of confusion. Let me start with Russia. And what I will say now is nothing new, really. I've been saying it, just doesn't make always headlines. That's understandable. The problem we had with Russia after the downing of the jet, the fact that Turkish leaders were not on a speaking terms with Russia, and all those reactions, measures from Russia to Turkey, which, by the way, we were not doing the same. We were more cool-headed about that. Was an abnormal situation. Within the alliance, in Europe, only Turkey wasn't speaking with Russia at the high level, and even Ukraine was speaking. So this abnormality is now behind us. That said, you might see a lot of statements, even during that crisis time with Russia, that we said many times, if the relations of Ukraine improves with Russia, or if Turkey's relations with Russia improves, Turkey's relations with Ukraine will continue in the positive path that we have determined. Why? Because Turkish-Ukrainian relations have a political, geopolitical, economic, and cultural logic rationale of its own. Relations with Russia does affect it somehow, But the path is clear. So we will continue on that path. Our policy toward Ukraine will not change simply because it's a policy of principle. Ukraine is our partner, strategic ally, and it's our neighbor. It's in our interest that Ukraine is strong, independent, well-reformed, democratic, integrating with Europe, preserving its national integrity, including Crimea, preserving its independence and sovereignty. So these are the basics. They were always like this from the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine, during our crisis with Russia. The fact that our relations will not change with regards to Ukraine, Crimea, etc., is known by the Russian side, is known by our allies, and it's known by the Ukrainian government, of course. But I understand the questions. On Crimea, I'm especially, it almost makes my blood boil when I hear these sort of things. Much of my portfolio is the Crimean issue. The Crimean Tatars are brothers who've been, the leadership of whom cannot go to their homeland. Our position is clear and will not change, and that's clear. Going back to the Russia affair relationship, that we were not on speaking terms, that relations were in some sort of frozen in this abnormal way, wasn't good for the alliance, wasn't good for Ukraine, wasn't good for, therefore, Crimea and Crimean Tatars, I believe. And because of that, when now things are moving more towards normalcy as much as they can, our allies are happy with that. I think Ukraine also realistically understands the positive from that. I don't know the details of what might be spoken in St. Petersburg, but I know that in each interaction over the past period, when we were on speaking terms, Ukraine, Crimea, of course, always did come up. It's become an agenda on our on the Turkish-Russian relations. We have different views on that. We will express them as frankly as we've done in the past, and we will use that channel as far as we can, in the benefit of Ukraine and Crimea, and Crimean Tatars, of course. So there is the single doubt in my mind regarding that. The West EU, this is a long relationship we have with the EU. We are already integrated in many ways to Europe, but membership, accession with the EU, that has a specific process, and you also are recognizing the complexity of that process. Turkey wants to be in the EU for similar reasons like Ukraine, I believe. We want to increase the standards of our people economically, politically, socially, to the best there is. We find them in the EU, until now. Had there been a Middle East union with the same standards, we would really be focusing on that too. Because culturally we are part of Europe, but we have cultural affinities to other areas too. And for Europe, Turkey has always represented, well, for those who are maybe wiser and more perceptive in their analysis, Turkey has always been an asset for EU in many ways. So both sides saw that this was a mutually rewarding process, and the accession process continued. We first came to the accession stage, and then the negotiations started. We hope it will go in that way. Turkey is going through some misfortune. Our area is not going, is in serious difficulty, but Europe too is also is not at its best. So we need good leadership on both sides to overcome this, to dispel misconceptions that might have been built for this or that reason. In Turkey, unlike maybe the case in the UK, you don't have a major rejection idea of the project of EU integration. Because after all, in its good times, this is a very successful project of integration. Let's forget about the problems, recent problems. But Turkey's problems with the EU has been, at the public level especially, has been that, not that sort of Euroscepticism we see within Europe, but a perception of double standards being used against Turkey in the accession process. A feeling of moving over the goalposts, even prejudicial attitudes in some parts of Europe, not of course everywhere, not everyone, certainly. And, well, we all know that the socio-political changes within Europe and rise of certain political attitudes, not very friendly to foreigners, not very friendly to inclusiveness, is a fact. So I think there's a mix of conditions that did not really help the dialogue. But both sides should look at this, because there's a lot to win for both sides and a lot to lose for both sides. Maybe more to lose for EU, we'll see. And we will try to do our homework. The relationship with EU, I mean, we are realistic in the sense that this has been also very positive for Turkey. The democratic victory that I'm mentioning here, what we want to preserve, the democratic achievements that we've reached in Turkey over the years, the EU has been very helpful, very instrumental in this. So we would expect that very positive trend relationship, that sort of interaction to go on, which is in the favor of Europe and Turkey, the EU and Turkey, because broadening Europe's space of peace and prosperity to Turkey and beyond, well, that makes a lot of sense, provided Europe keeps true to the values it advocates, of course. So I'm hopeful. It's a difficult process, but both the EU and Turkey has the administrative capacity, because these negotiations have been going on for a while. And with some more wise leadership, we can overcome this issue and put things back on track.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. At this point, the press conference is finished. Thank you for coming, and looking forward to seeing you here in the nearest future. Thank you.
Thank you.